The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for having invited me, despite the fact that they know that I know nothing about street outreaching work. I will also disappoint you because I cannot dance, I cannot sing, and I left my trumpet back in Stockholm. And if you would believe my neighbor, you should be lucky that I have. But I brought a little PowerPoint presentation, flashing things coming in, some text. The most sort of entertaining part will be me trying to sort of make slides come one at a time. I was once labeled the Swedish response to Mr. Bean after one presentation. So here we go. So this is the title of my speak. Social Exclusion in Modern Europe. What expectations should we have? I'm a director of the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. Whenever I talk about the future, people expect me to talk about downward trends, dystopias, that things are going downwards, getting worse all the time, everything. People sort of, when I mention something negative, they start to nod. And if I mention something in addition to that, they get very confident. And after a while, I sort of get the impression that people want to hear that everything is going down. And it's so bad that it doesn't matter if I do anything about it. I could just as well go back home and sit in front of the television and relax, because it doesn't matter whatever I do. Now, the Institute for Future Study has another agenda. We want to bring some facts, figures into the debate. We don't have visions for the future. Visions for the future, that's for politicians and ordinary people. So researchers and experts are not have nothing to say about what is a good society. That's something that we all have to decide and make up our minds about. And this is the disappointing part, the macro comparative perspective. No people, countries, nations, facts and figures, very little flesh. But I think it's an important context for understanding outreach work and for understanding why we need to think both on the macro level and on the micro level. I think it's also very important to define what we mean by social exclusion. And I was very helped by that 10 years ago when Amartya Sen got the Nobel Prize in Economics in Stockholm and came and gave a talk about exclusion, social exclusion. And he meant or argued that we need to think about social exclusion in terms of social relations. And that social relations are of many different kinds, but that we can see two fundamentally important kinds of relations in all kinds of society. One is with family and friends, and one is on the labor market, employment, self-employment or employment of any kind. But that makes up to the fundamental aspects of social exclusion. Then you have other risk factors, as the State Secretary talked about. Very important. Poor housing, poor education, health problems. There are risk factors for social exclusions, but they don't define social exclusion as such. And if we want to have an agenda for combating social exclusion, we should bear this in mind. And I also share, of course, the State Secretary's views that we need to attack the risk factors at the same time as we need to approach those in precarious situations threatened by social exclusion in our society. History, even more boring. If you're a very young and enthusiastic crowd looking forward, but I think it's important to remember history if we want to think strategically about how social policy can matter for combating social exclusion. And now, be very brief history, be one slide. And it's based, this slide, on research done by Seaboom Roundtree, who was a philanthropist, and he owned a chocolate factory, Britain, but he was also worried about the poverty situation in York at the end of the 19th century, and he studied the situation in the city of York. And he found some kind of regularities in the experience of poverty, meaning that, now comes the difficult part with the pointing, you see, childhood, youth, family, empty nest, old age, and poverty goes up and down here. Poverty is high among children, low among youth. With families with children, it also goes up. When children move away from home, it's some kind of relief, and then poverty increases with old age. And this picture you could take not only in York, in Oslo, in Stockholm, everywhere. 100 years ago, you saw this situation. When there were many consumers in the household, the risk of poverty was great. And when at old age, the work capacity decreased, there was also risk of poverty. And the modern welfare state can be seen as a response to these poverty risks that we experienced 100 years ago. And it was very important, Norway is a very good example here, that we could describe this in a systematic way in order to provoke politicians to take action. But then, of course, what kind of strategies, what kind of ideas should we build our attempts to reduce poverty? One can see two different strategies. One portrayed by British philosopher R.H. Tawney already in the 1930s, that the welfare state could be one important way of reducing inequalities. He also talked about ownership and industrial democracy, but the welfare state in forms of pensions, healthcare, was very important in order to bring about that also poor people could enjoy the kind of civilization that otherwise would be restricted to rich people. But this view was then later questioned by those who saw the middle class inclusion in the welfare state as a damage to poor people. That by including the middle class, the poor people were marginalized and could not get access to the kinds of benefits that rich people enjoyed. And this, I think, is critical also for you who are engaged in reaching out to poor people. Why should we spend money on health care for well-to-do people? And I think one can see four different models of welfare state strategies developing from these contradictions of who to include and to exclude from public policy and public protection. And the targeted model that is applied in Australia, for example, today, focuses state support to the poor segments of society and uses the Robin Hood strategy of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. The basic security model developed by William Beveridge in the UK says that the state should provide basic security, nothing more, and leave the rest to the market. The Bismarckian system the state corporatist model, organize social protection separately for different corporations, different occupational groups in society, so that state employees have their systems, workers have their systems, farmers their systems, white-collar employees their system. And it organized a kind of within-group solidarity, redistribution within the group. And what we call the encompassing model follows a different logic. Actually, it says somewhere in the Bible that you shall give to those who have. And it's a way of sort of being witty about the fact that by including the rich in the system of redistribution, you can actually achieve something. You can achieve the paradox of redistribution. But if you really want to help the poor, you should make sure that the middle class becomes not only the taxpayers, but also the beneficiaries of systems of social protection. Because as long as you exclude them from being beneficiaries of healthcare programs and pension, etc., they will be very greedy to the poor. And we have examined these statistics for countries and nations, and have seen and established this correlation, so that the more inclusive social protection systems are, the more generous they are towards the really marginalized groups, and the more efficient they are in reducing poverty and inequality. And again, with Amartya Sen, you can sort of observe that policies exclusively designed for poor people tend to be poor policies. And I think it's about creating coalitions with poor people, so that the poor should not be left standing alone. Now, poverty cycles have changed. If you remember the first green slide, we have remodeled the poverty cycles. And here, of course, different kinds of welfare state are more or less successful. And it's apparent that universal welfare states are more efficient in reducing poverty among families with children and among old people. So this is the kind of poverty cycle you see among the Nordic countries. Whereas other countries with less universalism in the protection system seem to be less successful in reducing poverty among families with children and among elderly people. But the both kinds of welfare state fail to reduce poverty among youth. And I think this, coming to 100 years after, stands out as the great challenge. And this is sort of reinforced by common European trends. And here I could, I'm sure I could extend these trends to many of the other countries represented here today. And it's about family formation being changed. First marriage is happening at the later stage in life. Children are born at the later age, for especially women. The out-of-wedlock births increase. Divorce rates increase also among those who marry. And fertility rates seem to be coming down a lot, at the same time as female labor force participation is increasing, and it's increasing everywhere. Inequalities are also increasing, and we all in Europe belong to aging societies. And this sort of asks questions whether we will approach common futures. We can be sure of two factors. One is that more people will be over 80 years of age. And what we call the age dependency ratio will increase. So the proportion between those above pension age or above 80 to those who are in the labor force will increase. So there are more passive members of society when we talk about activity on the labor market for the future. And we can do nothing about this. This is already inscripted in our population structures. So even if we can change fertility rates, even if you can attract migrant laborers, and even if you can change family formation, there is very little to suggest that we can change these fundamental aspects of our societies in the future. There's a lot to talk about new social risks, and in a way we talk about unemployment as a new social risk, but that was an old social risk as well. Old age is a risk, but that has been with us for a very long time. But I think that the youth poverty figures are definitely a new social risk. And I think that the bad news is then that we are facing these new challenges at the same time as two fundamental processes are affecting our societies. One is then that the aging of population is putting increased pressure on redistribution. So if we maintain this current entitlements for all people, this will cost us more in the future. It will cost us via the public sector, or via the family, or via the market. But there is no escape from this increased pressure on redistribution, unless we want to have old people living as they did 100 years ago in New York, or in Oslo, or in Stockholm. The other is that the globalization of the economy is making some tax bases more mobile, and this is making it more difficult for classical tax-financed welfare state to be sustainable. But what we have argued, and also others, is that we need to rethink the way we organize the welfare states. And I would argue that this is also relevant for outreach work. And we give a lot of attention to aging issues, pensions, healthcare, elder care, etc. But we should worry more about the resource base, how our tax policies, our social policies interact with fertility, education, and labor supply. That is the future tax base, the base on which we have to maintain our systems of redistribution in aging societies. And we need to change. 100 years ago, there was a political response to the poverty problems. Now we need to respond again and design our policies so that they are apt for the kinds of challenges that we are facing. I couldn't refrain from going back to a common project with Thomas Kattau. 10 years ago, I was involved in a study for Council of Europe, and Thomas Kattau was the project coordinator at the Council, and was very helpful in dealing with this project. The welfare state was in crisis. The welfare state seems always to be in crisis. And what the Council wanted us to do was to find ways to promote social policy and social rights whilst controlling the costs. And this was a trick that every politician wanted to deal with, to sort of keep the welfare state and make it cheaper. Not an easy thing, but I think the fundamental conclusion we made there was there's only one solution to this, and it's the same that we are struggling with at the Institute for Future Studies. We need to increase the number of taxpayers. And we need to think about our systems of social protection in these terms. We need to think like economists do about incentives. We need to avoid poverty traps, so that it actually makes sense for poor people to work more, so that they get more in pocket for extra work effort. We need to make sure that we invest in human capital. Remember that lifelong learning starts at age 1. also need to have social services that enable people with caring responsibilities to combine work at the market, to be taxpayers with caring responsibilities. And we need not to forget that we need to match all these policy designs with successful macroeconomic policies. And this is also a conclusion that I came to with my colleagues in the Swedish Welfare Commission that had been appointed by the Swedish government in 1999 to sort of examine what had happened not only to the welfare state but also to the welfare of our citizens in Sweden during the deep economic crisis. And what we found was that poor people are negatively affected by all retrenchment in the welfare state. But they're even more vulnerable to changes in the macroeconomic context. So unemployment and poor macroeconomic performance is the worst enemy of poor people, and particularly of young people, because they are the new entrants to the labor market. But the point I want to make is that if we really want to attack the problems of youth, we need to think about children. Because we know that problems of social exclusion among youth and adolescents are to an important extent shaped by their childhood conditions. So we need to organize family policy so that it can strengthen the resources of young people once they will enter into adult life. And the point here is that, again, policy design matters. If we design family policy in the right way, we can actually achieve two important things: poverty reduction and female labor force participation. And this is the simple idea we're working with, that the design of family policy will affect female labor force participation. If we design family support in ways that enable women to work on the market, this will also have a positive effect on child poverty, that it will reduce child poverty. Among European countries, it's clear that child poverty has increased, and it has increased most in countries which have failed to encourage the dual earner model. So in modern time, there is no way that a male breadwinner can support a family with children on levels that reach above our standard definitions of poverty. But the point is also here that we used to have a correlation that female labor force participation was negatively correlated to fertility, so that countries with high female labor force participation had low fertility rates. And now it's the other way around. And we can see movement in Europe, despite the fact that there's been sort of general retrenchment in social policy. One area is expanding, and this is linked to childbearing and parental leave systems. And it's also clear that they include ways of promoting a shared responsibility for care work of men and women. Now it becomes even worse. This is macroeconomy, which is even more boring and even more numbers. But it's a point with macroeconomics, because you can make a point when it comes to education and human capital, human resources. And when we examined the economic growth records among European countries in the post-war period, we found that countries that invested in education had a better growth rate, and that there were very large differences among European countries in how much they invested in education. So there is a way forward if we want to maintain growth that can sort of sustain our social policies aimed at poor people. It's of course also a point that we fail to maintain are investments in education, because the richer we get, the smaller the proportion we spend on education becomes. And this is, I think, a great worry. The richer we get, the lazier we get, and the more we spend on short-sighted consumption and the less on long-term investment in human beings. Also, the expansion of education is coming into conflict with our possibilities of forming families. And I think that deserves some special attention. But I think that European countries today should really think twice about how much they invest in education if they're worried about their aging population, and that the declining proportion of GDP spent on education is worrying. Also the fact that the way we succeed in investing in education differs a lot among countries. I've tried to argue that education is a way of investing in the future. I will try to show a graph that illustrates that some countries are better than others in pushing up the education levels in general, and also to helping those who are performing sort of poorly in school. I also think that it's important, if we worry about social exclusion, that we need to make investments that sort of decouples your social origin from your educational performance. And I think it's also clear that the policies aimed at improving lifelong education, and where outreach social work can be seen as one part of that, would be much easier if we really spent time in investing in good preschool education. What is also interesting, and to some extent very positive, is that women in many countries are now performing better than men at all levels of education. This is not yet having an impact on women's position on the labour market. I read an article in the British journal The Economist, which says that behind every successful man there is an amazed woman, suggesting that this is perhaps not the best way we use the fact that women are so good in the educational system. But there's one worrying trend, and this is that one group of young men are performing poorly in the school system, and this is a universal European phenomenon. I'm sorry, this is not sort of the most pedagogical graph, despite the fact it's trying to illustrate something very important. But we have different countries here: Finland, Ireland, United Kingdom, Sweden. I'm sorry that Norway is sort of to the right here, but this funny graphs tries to illustrate that the average, and this is the bold little thing in the middle, the average school performance differs a lot when you go from Finland down to Portugal. More important, when you look at Finland, you see the tails is sort of capturing the distribution of education performance, and it shows that the poor performers in Finland perform at the average level of those in Portugal. And I think this is something that we should discuss and learn more from each other, that the way we design not only social policies in order to reduce poverty in families with children, but also the way we design education systems have an impact on the crucial factor how your social background affects your life chances. Now, you can relax. The European Union has identified this problem. And it's not only pursuing, well, in Norway perhaps this is of less comfort than in Sweden, but we have seen that the market making in the European Union, which Norway definitely is a part of, is sort of matched, or there's a response to the development of a single market and freedom of movement of capital and labor, etc. And this response is labeled the Lisbon strategy, and it includes an agenda for promoting sort of soft values, unfortunately with rather soft means. The means is called the open method of coordination. It's a benchmarking system. So countries agree that we should all try to achieve a level of employment at 70%. And they have agreed that we need to have sustainable pension systems, and they have agreed that we have to define, and they've also agreed on a set of indicators. Same thing with health insurance, which is also part of this sort of old age part of social policy. The good news is that there are a number of indicators of social inclusion that countries have agreed on. Mostly these indicators reflect poverty, income poverty. There are some important indicators also related to education and access to education. But my point here is that if the future tax base of the European Union is about how we treat children and youth, then family policy and the situation of children and youth need to be put much higher on this agenda. And I have some support from important people here. The Commissioner, the President of the Commission, Barroso, said some years back, I heard it myself, I've seen it documented, the European social model is about social inclusion and equality of opportunity. And I think this is, again, a response to the fact that European citizens are not too happy about the way that the economic policy priorities are set on the European level. And they are protesting by saying no to the new constitutions in the Netherlands and France in 2005. And obviously some politicians have taken notice of that. But I also think that it provides a good agenda for pursuing the kinds of policies that I've been talking about. That are strategies to actually encourage that kind of goals, or to reach that kind of goals. And I've tried to put down these in 8 points. About human capital investment, about middle class inclusion, about universalism, about gender, care and work, about quality and quantity of employment. Another thing is about managing migration. And I also think that the Nordic countries serves as an example in the sense that we know that the correlation between your conditions during childhood is weaker in Nordic countries than in other countries. And this has to do something with the equality of conditions. So you cannot talk about equality of opportunity without thinking twice about equality of conditions. I've tried to also bring in some global perspectives, and not only because this conference is represented by 30 nationalities, but also because I think it matters a lot for outreaching social work here in Europe. And I think that the welfare state has been expanding in tandem with free trade policies, and has been seen as a way of making people accepting exposure to global markets. But we are in a new context in the sense that the capital markets are deregulated, that some of the tax bases are definitely more mobile. But I think that we are still free to choose how much of the wage that we take home in direct pay and how much we do deal with that in terms of a social wage. But the globalization has also other aspects. And I think it's important to underline that we have a global population development, where population growth in some regions have now for some time and will for another couple of decades trigger large waves of international migration. We have 200 million people of international migrants. In China we have 150 internal migrants. But the international migrants are then only part or also interregional migrants. So we have African migrants in Europe, but these African migrants are a small majority of the total population of African migrants who move within Africa, first and foremost. But I think that we need to think globally also when we deal with social problems here. We need to think of social policy and development policy. And we need to understand that our migrants belong to two communities at the same time, and that the successful outreaching social work with them has to recognize this. Also, if we want to be more successful in combating poverty, not only here, but on a global scale. And this is, in fact, what the nations of the world have agreed on in the Millennium Development Goals. So, what expectations should we have for social inclusion of marginalized groups in the future? Well, I think that we could be pessimistic, or we could be optimistic. I think it's very important that we take opportunities such as this conference to promote what I would label a knowledge-based approach. That we can share experience from different contexts. That we should together combat prejudice and wishful thinking and base our policy recommendations on a more realistic view of how the world works. And I think that professionalization of outreaching social work is one important aspect of this. Also, I would end by having a little recommendation, despite the fact that my own experience with outreaching social work is very limited. If we worry about social inclusion on a macro level, then I think we should worry a lot about social relations on the micro level as well. That we should focus our outreaching social work on building social relations. And I would also like to end with a little optimistic note in the sense that politics can matter. It can matter on the European level, on the national level, but also on the regional level. I met the local mayor from a municipality outside Stockholm yesterday. He's bold, he's a migrant, came to Sweden in the mid-1990s, is now a local mayor. He has for his inhabitants, his young inhabitants, promised that they will get a work when they finish school for the summer. This goes for all 16-year-olds, 70-year-olds, and 18-year-olds. This is not a promise for 90% of the youth in his municipality, not for 99% of the youth in his municipality, but it's about 100%. And I think it's about some of the more fundamental aspects of combating social inclusion, trying to build social relations on the labor market. Thank you very much.